Holmes, and I am the USA Today Bestselling Author of the Paranormal Cozy Mystery Series, Haunting Danielle. I also write under the pen name Anna J. McIntyre. Today I am filming in a different venue. You might notice I am not in the cottage with a green screen behind me. I am sitting in my home office today, and the reason for that is several viewers mentioned that there was a distracting sound in the background, and I'm pretty sure it might have been the refrigerator in the cottage that can get a little noisy sometimes. I don't really notice it because I'm sort of used to it, but I thought I would try filming in here today and see if the audio improves, so let me know in the comments below if it sounds any better today. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to what I'm going to discuss today, and the topic today is how do authors get their ideas? It's a question that most authors get asked frequently. It's a very common question. One reason I decided to tackle this particular topic, I was surfing on Amazon the other day looking for books in my genre, and I came across one with a very interesting cover, and then I read the description and I was a little surprised because it could have been the description for the first book in my Haunting Danielle series, The Ghost of Marlowe House. I took a screenshot of the blurb and I sent it to my daughter and I said, well, what do you think? And she said, oh gosh, that just sounds like your book. It's not the first time this has happened. Several years ago, my daughter called me up and she said, Mom, you have to watch this movie. It is so similar to Haunting Danielle. So I went and I looked up on Netflix, found the movie, and I watched it, and sure enough, it was very similar. But the most striking similarity were the character names. Many of the main characters in the movie were the same character names that were in my book. And I was like, whoa. And so I quickly looked up when the movie had been made. And I was very relieved to discover that it had been put out after my books had been published. My first book had been published. And one of the reasons I was relieved is I was afraid that somebody that had read my book might come across the movie and then assume that I had, lifted all my ideas from the movie. And I didn't want to deal with that. And so I was very happy to discover that mine had come out first. Now, does that mean that that movie or that the book that had been published after mine with the similar blurb, does that mean that they stole my ideas and put it into their work? Well, not necessarily. Like it says in Ecclesiastic, there is nothing new under the sun. There really is nothing new under the sun. And according to many experts, there are only 6 plot lines out there. And what are those 6 plot lines? Well, I Googled that question today, and this is what I came up with. According to Google, the 6 plot lines are Overcoming the Monster, Rags to Riches, The Quest, Voyage and Return, Comedy, Tragedy, and Rebirth. Well, now those are really very general, and so, yeah, there are probably, 6 general plot lines, but sometimes we see similarities that go a little bit deeper than that. And is that unethical? And is that wrong? When I was in college, I took a television writing course, and we were taught that it was very common practice to repurpose storylines. So for example, let's say you're watching an episode in one TV series, and then down the line you watch another TV series, and one of their episodes, the storyline is really similar, and you think, wow, what a coincidence. Well, it may not be a coincidence. It might just be that the writers use that particular storyline, and they will reuse them over and over again. It is one way that writers within the television industry get their ideas. Now, another way, which is similar, is to retell fairy tales. Classic fairy tales are often retold, and an example of this is Cinderella. Cinderella has been retold many, many times. And then, of course, we have retelling of classic works. For instance, Jane Austen, many of her books have been retold over and over again. Some authors, when they're out of ideas, what they will do is similar to with the examples I just mentioned. They will think of a book that they have read, that they've enjoyed, and they will repurpose those ideas and create their own. First, they pick their book, and let's say they pick Tarzan. So instead of it being a man, they're going to make it a woman. And instead of having it from England and taking place in Africa, they're going to make an American heiress, and she's going to be in the wilds of Montana in current time. And so the story gets, reworked, and we're not going to have apes, so we're going to have some other maybe wolves, and And so the story gets moved around and they come up with their own book, but it actually started with Tarzan. So that is how some authors get their ideas. So have I ever done that? Well, I suppose all authors have, in a way. They get ideas, they get inspirations. Some of them don't do it quite like that, where they, pick the story and intentionally and then, go down the line and change tweak the different things so they can make it their own. But I think unintentionally, we very often will do that. I can think of one instance for sure that I have done that is in my book, While Snowbound by Anna J. McIntyre, my pen name. In that book, it is about a young woman who she is not really impressed by celebrities, but she finds herself snowbound with a rock star, and she's not interested in him at all, but of course they fall in love. Now that is a very common trope. It's been done over and over again, and when I wrote the book, I couldn't really sit down and say, well, this is the one I'm taking it from and I'm going to make these changes. It was just more or less a trope that I enjoyed reading. I've read those kind of books before and I wanted to write my own. So that is an example of doing it, but not quite doing it where you actually pick the book and then start changing every item, to make your own. So it can be done both ways. So that is one way some authors get their ideas. They repurpose storylines from other writers. Now, I was accused of doing this by several book reviewers who read the first book in my Haunting Danielle series, The Ghost of Marlowe House. According to them, that book was just like The Ghost of Mrs. Muir. Well, I have to disagree with them. Although I will say that that TV show and movie did inspire me in the same way that Topper inspired me. I enjoyed watching lighthearted ghost stories when I was growing up. I'm not a fan of the thriller horror ghost stories that give you nightmares. That's not my cup of tea, but I did enjoy watching the more lighthearted, good-natured ones that you would find in Topper and The Ghost of Mrs. Muir. I found those very fun, and that's what I choose to write. Now, as far as my first book being the same one as The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, well, no, I don't think it is, although it is a similar trope. They both involve a widow who moves into a haunted house. But like I said, that's more of a trope. It's not really a retelling of a story. And beyond that, there are many differences, and the big difference is mine is a mystery. It's a cozy mystery. The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, that is not a mystery whatsoever. So that's a huge difference right there. There is another difference in that Danielle, in my story, she could always see ghosts. So very often in ghost stories, when it's a haunted house situation and they first encounter the ghost, there's fear going on. There's no real fear going on when Danielle first encounters the ghosts in the very first book. There's more sort of annoyance. She has seen ghosts before and she didn't expect to see one, and she doesn't really want to see one now, and she doesn't want one in her house that she's just moving into. So that is the situation with my story. And while there wasn't a lot of fear factor in The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, I think there's a lot of differences, and I will have to say I didn't really think of that book when I was writing mine. So how did I get my idea for my Haunting Danielle series? Well, first I need to say I've always enjoyed writing mysteries. In fact, the very first book I ever wrote at age 14 was a mystery. Then in college, I took a screenwriting class, and I had to write a script for that class, and I decided to write a mystery. Years later, when I self-published my first book of fiction, well, that was a romance. And I continued to write and publish more romances. But as I went along, they shifted into romance mysteries as opposed to pure romance. I then decided I wanted to genre hop and write a cozy mystery series. And when I hopped, I was going to take my real name, Bobbi Holmes, with me and write under that as opposed to the Anna J. McIntyre pen name that I had written the romances under. For one reason, those were more R-rated, where I know a cozy is more of a G-rated read. Another thing I decided I wanted to write a ghost cozy. And one reason for that is I had always had ghosts a little bit in some of my McIntyre books, the Coulson series in particular. I have 5 books in that series, and they're, like I say, they're more R-rated. They're grittier romances and family saga. But in the different books, I had instances where somebody would see a spirit that had somebody that had passed, maybe a spirit that said goodbye. Wasn't ghost as much as maybe a spirit or apparition, however you want to say it. But I'd always sort of toyed with that in my different books. And so when I was going to leap over to the cozies, I decided I wanted to explore ghosts a little bit more fully. And so I decided I would put those into my cozies. The next decision was where I was going to have the setting. Now, very typically, cozy mysteries are set in a small town somewhere. And my husband and I had taken trips to visit our son and daughter-in-law. They live up in Oregon, in Portland. And sometimes when we visit them, we would go along the coast, and it's so beautiful along the Oregon coast, and I had thought that would make a great setting for a cozy mystery series. The next thing I had to decide is what the house was going to look like that the ghost was going to be in my imaginary fictitious town on the Oregon coast. Well, for me, a Victorian was was no-brainer. I was going to have a Victorian. But I went to my cover designer, who happens to be my daughter, and as I mentioned before, my covers have the house on it. And when Elizabeth designed the covers, she didn't put a traditional Victorian. She put, it's called a Second Empire with a mansard roofline. And so that's mentioned in the book, but the house that I describe in the book, that's not really something I came up with as much as my cover designer came up with. So now we have the location, which was inspired by my son and his wife. And we have the house, which was sort of a joint inspiration between my daughter and me. We have the ghosts, because I've always sort of been interested in ghosts, and I had mentioned them in previous books. And also I was influenced by Topper and the Ghost of Mrs. Muir. But like I said, when I was putting together the series, I didn't think of the Ghost of Mrs. Muir at all. That wasn't really on my radar when I was putting down the book. Maybe subconsciously it was, but I don't think so. And so the next thing we had to come up with was the characters. Now, I decided I wanted my ghost to be from the Roaring Twenties for a couple of reasons. One is he is the same generation as my grandparents. And having him the same generation as my grandparents, I actually knew somebody from his era that I can think about when I'm writing his character. And I can think of stories that my grandparents told about growing up that I can use in my books, which I have in the past. So one reason I chose to put Walt from the 1920s was because that was an era that my grandparents were from. Another reason I chose the 1920s is it's an interesting era. It's the Roaring Twenties, and on one hand I can have a ghost that's sort of old-fashioned because he comes, from almost 100 years ago. On the flip side, it's, he comes from an era which is the Roaring Twenties. They had, Prohibition and moonshining, and so it was, you could make it more interesting for Walt. And so that's sort of how it went along when I put together the series. It was a collection of things. It's not one thing. It definitely wasn't a book that I sat and tweaked to make it my own. So that kind of gives you an idea of how I put together the series of Haunting Danielle. There was one TV show that did influence me in writing the Haunting Danielle series. And it's one that might really surprise you because it's not a ghost TV series and it is not a cozy mystery. It was Veronica Mars. Now, I had never watched Veronica Mars when it was on television, but shortly before I started the Haunting Danielle series, I discovered it on Netflix and I found myself binge watching it. I finished that series and within a couple weeks' time, I couldn't stop watching it. Now, I have not binge watched a lot of shows. I know a lot of people are into binge watching. I don't binge watch a lot of shows. Sometimes I go along and then I get a little bored and I don't finish it. But Veronica Mars, I couldn't stop watching it. And so when I was finished with the show, I asked myself, what was it about Veronica Mars that made me keep watching? And I decided it was the way the writers allowed the characters to evolve and change and grow throughout the show as it went on. And there were characters, for example, in the very first few episodes that you might really hate. There was a couple guys that they were really jerks, but by the end of the show, you really liked them. And just the same way, there were some people in the very beginning of the show that maybe you liked, but by the end of the show, you really didn't like them anymore. You got to know them better. And I liked that. I liked watching the characters grow, evolve, change, and it was at a different place at the end of the show as in the beginning. So that's something that I really took to heart, and when I started writing my series, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted my characters to evolve over time, and I think they have, because where they are right now, I'm getting ready to put out book 25 that comes out in August. Where my characters are in book 25 is vastly different than where they were in book number 1. And my readers, yeah, they understand that. It's very, very different. So I have to say that Veronica Mars, she influenced me way more than The Ghost of Mrs. Muir ever did. So that about wraps it up today. Those are some of the ways some writers get their ideas. And if you're a writer out there posting comments, some ways you've gotten your ideas for some of the books that you've written. I know some people say they get their ideas, they dream about them, or some people get them from newspaper articles or their genealogical research. There's lots of ways that you can get ideas for things you want to write. So why don't you share yours down below? And for now, I think I'm going to see what else I need to get done today. And for all of you out there, stay safe and write on.